the effort that's gone into creating this report will yield tangible results in terms of, hopefully through this discussion, and if you access the report, and that I hope you will, it'll give you a good sense of why you should care about this and what you can do if you do care about this, and what all of us can do. So on that note, I'm going to ask Jonathan to give us a sort of brief summary of the findings of this report, and perhaps also very quickly recap the findings of the first report for us so that we can contextualize this one. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thanks, Pragya and Mr. Chenoy. And indeed, this is a very important subject, close to the heart of the British Council on our work in arts and culture here across the world, and in India in particular. I'm just going to share my screen so I can come to the report summary. Here it is. Hopefully you can see that now. So as has been intimated, this is the second of the reports. The first we published in July, and the first report covered the period of March until June, July, and the second report covers the time between then and the end of October. So it's covering a kind of significant portion of the period of lockdown, which led up until June here in India. And then when lockdown rules were relaxed, it covers relaxation of those rules and the impact on the COVID-19 pandemic on the creative sectors following the relaxation of lockdown rules in June. So a quick summary. The report gives insight into scale of impact on creative sectors, arts companies, artists, managers, and stakeholders. Comparisons, developments, changes over a sustained period of time between March and November of last year. And systemic actions being taken to strengthen the creative economy from within the sector and externally from business and government. And it makes recommendations based upon the findings for how to strengthen further the creative economy during the pandemic and beyond the pandemic as we start to look toward the future. The findings from the first report give really a snapshot of those early months of COVID-19. And what it describes is the creative sectors are both in the formal and informal economy here in India. 41% of the sector stopped functioning during those early months of lockdown. 88% of the creative sectors across advertising, broadcast, publishing, performing arts, crafts, and so forth, film, are MSMEs. It's this very significant size of micro, small, and mid-sized enterprises form the bedrock of the creative economy here in India. 61% of the sector established within 4 to 10 years stopped functioning during lockdown. And 88% of the sector fear the long-term impact of social distancing on their work and ability to continue and regroup and reframe their work. We look at the findings of the second report that we published just before Christmas and that we are launching today. There's a clearer narrative emerging because we now have a comparison between the first and second cycle of the research. And what this says to us now is that the creative economy is contracting. Organizations are closing permanently to avoid bankruptcy. Creative businesses are contending with increasingly difficult choices to remain resilient. Individual professionals and artisans are facing short-term hand-to-mouth existence. And the sectors are adapting to digital and live business models. And as we look to the future, what that might look like in hybrid models. And some of the workforce are leaving the creative economy and changing careers altogether. So the depth and range of impact from the second report shows how really the extent of COVID-19 pandemic is really deepening in terms of the creative economy here in India. And if we look at some of the key statistics from the second report in particular, 72% of the sector earn 50 lakhs or less per annum across in rupees. 52% of the workforce are women, and increasingly that means that the impact on gender inequality care of the pandemic is at high risk. 16% of the creative sector are facing permanent closure now. This is before Christmas. 16% of the sector are facing closure now. 26% fear that they will not be able to continue beyond March of this year. So in terms of contraction, this is live decisions being made by artists and organizations in the heat of COVID-19 now. 41% of the respondents are facing loss of 50% of their annual income, and that was 33% in the first survey. So the deepening loss of income is expanding in the second quarter of this financial year, and as we look towards this coming quarter, as we're now in Q4. Measures needed to sustain the economy, the creative economy, and this is what the sector has said to us with what they would do with support, either government or corporates or banking or use of their own reserves. 34% would use to cover lost income, 24% to meet basic overheads, and 17% for staff-related costs to retain their staff in their workforces. 10% of the sector have moved online and online sales platforms, and that's an increase from the first survey. And 16% in survey 1 say that this may be due to more face-to-face activities where relaxation of lockdown shifted in Q2. Therefore, there has been a shift back to some face-to-face interaction with audiences. There's been some kind of level of shift from the first survey to the second survey in terms of face-to-face interaction. But increasingly in sector 2, in quarter 2, 10% have moved to online sales platforms to meet income levels. 2% of the sector have been able to access loans from banks, and 1% have been able to access government grants and support from the government. That's in some cases at national level and at state level from government interventions to support the sector. Mid to long-term effects on the creative economy that's come from the second survey report. 19% of the sector say that despite relaxation in June, they still remain closed in Q2 and in Q3 to come, and Q4 increasingly likely to have those who are saying they may be facing closure by the end of March. 90% of the sector still fears the long-term impact of COVID-19, and that's an increase of 2% from the first survey. And 22% of the sector is forecasting 75% annual loss by the end of this financial year. 60% of the sector believes it will take at least 9 months to a year to see early signs of recovery for the creative economy. So the long-term impact of COVID-19 on India's creative sectors is deepening and expanding, and we still need to see what that recovery might look like and how we can start to look at what recommendations could look like to sustain the sector in the immediacy of these next months and beyond these next months in the next year, financial year and calendar year to come. And we'll come back to what those recommendations look like over the course of the session. So with all that said, I'm going to hand back to you now, Bhagya.
Thank you for that, Jonathan. And before we start to unpack, some of these findings from the report, I think we need to address a somewhat more fundamental question, which is what is it that we speak of when we speak of the cultural sector? Like I mentioned in my introduction, unfortunately, it's the understanding of what we speak of when we speak of the cultural sector is sort of very diffuse and very amorphous. And at least in part, it kind of lends to the apathy that we see towards the cultural sector on the whole, from even the consumers of culture, and definitely from institutions and stakeholders elsewhere. So that is going to be the first question that I ask Sanjoy and Rashmi to take on. What do we speak of when we speak of the cultural sector? And why do we encounter the kind of apathy that we do when speaking of the cultural sector, and what it's going through?
Rashmi, are you going first?
Go ahead, Sanjoy. I'll follow up.
Thank you, Dilip, and thank you, Jonathan. And as all of you can see, the report really puts to the fore, or brings to the fore, the real crisis in the creative economy sector. It's not just a problem, it's not just a pandemic, it's an incredible crisis of loss of income, closure, artisans and artists not being able to get food to the table, and much more. Pragya, I'm not sure whether it's about apathy, it's about ignorance. Because the creative sector, as we know, people don't get their heads around it. They think this is a bunch of people with long hair like me who are dancing or singing themselves, silly, rather than doing a real job, not realizing that the creative economy today, or the creative sector across the world, and especially in India, goes everything from the ragi in the Gurdwara to the Kathak dancer, to the pandal maker, to the lighting designer, to the backstage person, to the artisan in Banaras, to the weaver, and so much more, to the person curing the skin who's going to be put onto the mridangam. So you're looking at an impact across the entire creative, design, artistic, artisanal community. And if you look at India today, and we know, we've seen the farmers' protests and so on and so forth going on, we know that what happens between the sowing season and harvest, most of the agrarian economy is also driven by the arts. They weave, they stitch, they sing, they do puppetry, they are the Manganyas, the Langas, the weavers of Falaudi, etc. And in earlier times, when there used to be a natural disaster, Pragya, what you did was you migrated from your district, which was impacted by the natural disaster, flood, drought, earthquake, whatever, to the next district. And you performed there, or you created there, or you sold there, and you sent your money back. This is the first time in our collective living history memory that you've had a lockdown that has brought everything to a standstill. So those people who think still it's about, oh, why can't you use Zoom to, do a music concert or dance? That's not what it's about. It's really about the entire ecosystem. And again, Pragya, I want to end saying to you that what people forget in India, especially our planners and policy people, where the focus is on manufacturing, which I believe, that ship has long left the port, and I've said this to you many times. And for every $1 million of investment in manufacturing, you create approximately 9 jobs. And this is true of India, it's true across the world. In the creative sector, for every $1 million of investment, you create 99 jobs. And this is a sector, again, that you can really make the impact from the village, from the rural, from the semi-urban into the urban economy at the grassroots level. Because every time you create something around a heritage space or an intangible heritage, that the economy impacts, and you've seen that. Whether it's the vendor, the e-rickshaw driver taking people to that place, the nearby restaurants, the tour operators, the person selling you whatever that guidebook is, the print, the publicity, the marketing, the hotels. I mean, I can go on as I do impassioned for whoever's listening. But that is the problem. There's no understanding of this sector. It's not about apathy. And what these reports, I hope, will continue to focus on and be able to build is that knowledge base. That there is a science behind what we are putting out. This is just not numbers that have been, snatched from the sky and being thrown randomly. This is a detailed survey for the first time in 3 parts. And we've seen part one, the impact. We're seeing part two. And is there light in the future? No, there isn't, because there has been no policy change to be able to address the need of the moment. Therein lies the problem.
That was wonderfully put, Sanjoy. As usual, whether the ignorance came first or the apathy came first is a chicken and egg question. But one thing that I would definitely like to add to what you just pointed out, and is super, super important, is that I hope that we are beginning to question the wisdom that people can just leave their villages, leave where they were born, and all migrate to the cities where jobs are going to be created, because that was a way of thinking that was imposed by foreign institutions upon developing countries and definitely upon India. But that model has been failing consistently, and like the mass migration when the pandemic started showed us, the importance of creating vibrant economies within villages and districts of villages is very, very, very important, and arts and culture have a great role to play in it. We will come back to this and talk in some detail. But Rashmi, the question that I wanted to pose to you was your thoughts on what leads to the apathy, ignorance, and the sort of very amorphous understanding of what the cultural sector means. And following up from there, what did that mean for you guys in terms of the challenges faced in creating a report such as this?
Yeah. Thank you for that, Pragya. I think that's, and thanks also Sanjoy and Jonathan for setting this kind of context. I would like to speak to something that Sanjoy raised about what is included in the sector and why is it that there is this confusion that is abound about what is included in the sector. In fact, what everybody knows is that we don't have a formal culture policy. In fact, there have been various points during the last 7 decades that senior cultural, whether it's policymakers, academics, artists have argued against having a culture policy for its ability to perhaps circumvent public opinion using culture. So there has been a very real red flag that has been raised in the past, and the arm's length model has been endorsed for that reason. But just to sort of understand whatever little is managed around culture as, whether it's across 9 different central departments that we find culture being administered today, where is it all coming from? And here I'd like to bring in one of the documents that I look to a lot, which is a country profile, a culture policy profile by World Culture Policies in Asia Focus. And this was put together by Ashish Rajadaksha, P. Radhika, and Raghavendra Tenkayala, where in the first few pages, and I'm going to quote from the report, they locate the notion of culture, what culture is within policy, in the nationalist context. And this report says that so pervasive is the representation of culture as a national legacy, both Sanskriti, being cultured, and as parampara, tradition, that no corresponding practice or corresponding policy statement involving the arts could exist without, in some form, incorporating or at least adequately accounting for prevailing definitions of Sanskriti, which is being cultural. This imbalance has been incarnated into the very substance of all prevalent arts and culture policy ever since this period, well into the present. So the understanding of culture is that it's a part of us, it's a part of our identity. It needs to be, everything that we do in culture needs to represent that. Hence, notions around economy, notions around jobs, notions around measurement and value don't come into that framework of conversation. Because we've not had this approach of thinking about culture that's breathing and thriving and not just as tradition and sort of being cultural, what this has meant is that over the years, the policy and administrative perspective has not kept pace with the evolution of the sector. So while in the 50s, you had this building of institutions and some amount of money given to artists in some ways, somehow you've not accounted for the formalization, for instance, of the film sector into the industry in the late 90s. Or for that matter, how a performing arts has found an international market beyond festivals of India. And the fact that newer careers in the contemporary art making are emerging, whether it's hip hop, stand-up, or even documentary theater. So it's not just the more popular, sort of careers in the arts. None of this finds any location in any central arts policy. Neither is there a body formed to investigate these contemporary changes in culture making, production, distribution, and economics. What we have instead, that I was mentioning earlier, is that you have the sector across 9 different central departments. So no, it's not one organization or department that is charged with thinking about where and how is this entire ecosystem evolving? Moreover, discussions about the structural issues, it doesn't even find space in academic dialogues. So this report was brought out in 2014, if I'm not mistaken, or 13. It was supposed to have been, there was supposed to have been a revised version, but it yet hasn't been brought out. Also, this was not by the government, it was by independent cultural regional organizations. If there are any theoretical investigations that do happen, they are nascent. What this lends to is that there is neither an understanding of the sector or its evolution, and neither is there a critical dialogue around the needs and movements of what is going on here. The value that it brings to the country, and generally, as you were mentioning, how it sort of helps us understand who we are as human beings. So when you talk about the word amorphous, which literally means that anything that's amorphous has no definite shape, form, or structure, I think it could be said so for the culture sector. It's not understood to have a shape. Everything seems to be included in it. Nobody really has a sense of what this structure looks like. We even tend to borrow from global terminology such as creative industries, which exist on a UNESCO level. It exists across the globe, but we haven't found too much critical conversation of some of the alignment of these terms to our realities and the implications of its use. So who are we? Why are we? How are we contributing to this kind of definition of who we are? More importantly, there is absolutely no data. There is no comprehensive study done to understand who is a part of the sector, what is a part of the sector, what's the value they bring to us as a society, culture, and economy, and even humanity. So what this essentially boils down to is that nobody really has a stake in thinking about these concerns. And even when you do have a stake, you don't have the power or pathways to power to actually act upon it. And hence, a study of this sort becomes very important because it provides evidence which you can use beyond your subjectivities to think about what's the right direction for the sector. And this is something that it's important to sort of acknowledge about research in general. So when we're talking about the challenges that we faced with respect to actually delivering this study, who do we go to ensure that more and more people are filling up this survey? We had the survey in English, and then it was sent. It was set up in different languages. It was in Bangla, Hindi, Tamil at the very minimum, and I know there are a couple of more languages as well. Who are we speaking to? Can we reach out to associations that can send it to their members? There are hardly any associations that we can speak to for the sector. We did tie up with a bunch of other organizations, who we will acknowledge at the end of the session, but the craft sector, the design sector, the Association of Design of India, a bunch of other organizations that have supported us. But these are, again, independent associations. Where are the central agencies that we can go to say, listen, let's get more and more data and evidence? This survey was put out between all our networks. I believe it reached between 4,500 to 6,000 potential respondents, of which 456 people filled the survey. It may seem as a small sample set, but it was a 30-minute survey with a lot of information around their turnovers, their understanding of the sector, and that cuts across individuals and organizations. Over 2 surveys, there were about 750 respondents who filled the survey, of which 147 filled the survey both times. So that's the number that we're going to isolate and look at in the third survey as a tracer study. How did they evolve over this year, and where do they stand? So in speaking of the challenges around this survey, we intended to measure the entire populace as much as possible for all of the respondents. That we were not able to do across survey 1 and survey 2, just because of the kind of response we got across various languages over these 2 editions. But what it definitely speaks of is that we have about 10% of the survey response rate. The national average in India, when we speak of market research, tends to be around 3 to 5%. So we're anyways higher than general average of online survey response rates. In addition, this was a 30-minute survey, so it took a lot of time off someone to come and fill this information and give us their valuable insights. So in that respect, I can say that we have a confidence rate of 95%, giving validity and assurance to the total quantitative research findings with respect to this survey. And finally, I think we also looked at a lot of secondary data collection and analysis, which you'll find at the end of the report, which speaks to the backdrop of the context prevailing in the culture sector. For instance, how badly has the festival sector been impacted? Because as you know, over the last 10, 15 years, a lot of the economy has moved towards creating events and festivals and experiences. And those were the first to have been cut down. So what has it meant for that part of the creative economy? I think that's pretty much where we are, and we're just looking to more and more partner organizations to help us get the word out for this survey, the report, as well as the next one.
Thank you for that overview, Rashmi. And for those of you who might be interested to get in a little bit more into the detail where the methodology of the survey is concerned, please do read the report. And as you do, it's a detailed report, more of it will become evident. But I'd like to, in the interest of time now, move on to really what I think is the meat of this conversation, which is trying to understand what these findings mean for us and unpack some of the challenges that lie ahead, as well as solutions. And in that regard, the first thing I'd really like to talk about is take forward what Sanjay was talking about. You know, when we think of the cultural sector as just a bunch of artists or musicians or whatever, but we often fail to see the synapses that they have with the society and the economy on the whole. So when a cultural sector suffers, there's also an opportunity cost of what the creative economy could have yielded, not just for the people who are at the center of it all, not just for the future of arts, heritage, Sanskriti, you know, those names that those terms that we so bandy about, but also for the economy on the whole. But whenever one is talking about the opportunity cost of anything, it's best to kind of, before going into what is, talk of or get a sense of what could be. And for that, I would really like to ask Jonathan to join us again and give us a UK perspective. In many ways, we're similar countries. In many ways, we're very, very different countries. But it would be interesting to kind of get a sense of how the UK has been approaching and what it might have gotten right, and where there's room for improvement when it comes to their approach of dealing with the creative economy.
Very good question. And absolutely, whilst there are parallels, there are also very significant differences. Of course, scale is the predominant difference in terms of India and the UK. If we know that there are 200 million artisans living and working as craftspeople in India, well, that's almost 3 times the population of the UK entirely. So there are scale differences. But I guess where perhaps the UK government is sort of simpler structurally is because there is one government department in the UK which covers all of the creative sectors, which is the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, which is therefore a simpler structure in terms of policy making and decision making. And back in the late 1990s, when the department was being founded, they set about actually segmenting what was meant and understood by the creative economy. So advertising, broadcast, publishing, galleries and visual arts, they were all split up into different categories. So there are 11 categories which segment the economy in the UK, which means that it's also understood in terms of not just the artistic value, which is of course predominant, but also the value to the GDP of the country, and how the UK acts as a magnet for visitors, for tourists, and internal cultural tourism as destinations in their own rights, whether that's going to a theatre, going to a festival, going to a gallery. It understands the ecosystem because it's been mapping the sector for nearly 20 plus years now. And how that also functions is it's also embedded in the tax system. So when we have the complexity of the informal and the formal economy in India, the creative economy in the UK is part of essentially the formal economy. So income tax, VAT, corporation tax is all coded as part of the creative economy. So the Treasury knows what is generated for the Treasury by every pound spent by investment into Arts Council England, Arts Council Northern Ireland, Arts Council Wales, Creative Scotland. So when the arm's length principle that Rashmi has referenced in terms of taxpayers' money being invested back into the creative economy through those arm's length organizations, it also knows what the organizations generate back in terms of the exchequer. So when last summer, in the early months of COVID-19, the government actually putting the first sector to support was the creative economy. And the government then invested £1.57 billion into the sector because it understood that it also generates back into the economy almost £11 billion a year. So understanding the economic value of the asset of the creative economy and the different sectors to the wider wealth of the country, let alone the arts in terms of understanding the world in which we live in, and especially as we look to what happened last year, when we all turned to television, to Netflix, to reading, to going online to experience the arts, because that was the only way we could do that. We needed the arts for solace and solidarity. So some of what we're also thinking about here is the soft stuff of the arts is also really critically important to our well-being. And especially as we look towards COVID-19, and we hope that the vaccine starts to come through quickly, but simply we also know that we need the arts to sustain ourselves, our understanding of ourselves and the world around us, and how that also feeds into GDP in the UK and actually also GDP here in India. It's all part of that wider global benefit that we get from the creative economy of the arts and culture. And I think that's what the UK brings to bear, really. Back to you, Pragya.
Thank you, Jonathan. And you're absolutely right. When we think of why the arts and culture and heritage need to be preserved, we think of the intangible value of the arts. We think of what they bring to us as human beings, as a culture, as society, as civilization. And we also, of course, think of the artist at the center of it all and how their lives and livelihoods are impacted by what they choose to do. And in choosing to do so, they are choosing to kind of help us preserve what is our heritage and what is important to our existence and what we can turn to in times of crisis. But there is a sort of larger role that the arts can play. And Sanjoy, I'd like to bring you in here because you already touched upon some of this in your first answer. But what might be some of the lessons that we can take from the UK in terms of developing a sort of robust creative economy? What might be some of the homegrown solutions that we can look at? And what are the big missing pieces that we are confronted with in terms of translating all of this and executing all of this?
It starts with what Jonathan said, Pragya. I mean, if we are able to build a case that this is a contribution to GDP and the local economy, and be able to map it, immediately you've got the basic structure in place. Then you can't say that, oh, this is not a sector, this doesn't contribute to jobs, doesn't create any money back into the system, etc. The beauty of this across Europe and most of the developed world, as well as countries like Singapore, etc., is they've been able to map it. And they've been able to map it to the last pound which is coming into the sector. I think the biggest challenge that we face going forward is kickstarting demand, but I'll come to that in a second. When you're talking about gaps, yes, the national education policy today has set into place certain possibilities or the potential of why the arts is important. But I want to go beyond that and say that today, if you look at, say, something like design is then sort of looked at, oh, you want to do design, you go to NID or go to NIFT or do one of the Pearl Academy or one of these fancy institutions post graduation or post your school. I'm saying that we have to inculcate stuff like design and aesthetics and the arts from KG. Because what does it do? What does the arts do? It does 2 or 3 things. One, it allows you to look at the same truth from different points of view. And as we've seen today, that it is very important for us to realize that a truth can coexist with other perspectives of that truth without it being your way or the highway. So that's one. The second thing, when you're looking at design, it's not just about creating a phone or a laptop, but it's about the back end of the Zoom. It's about the process design of management, of innovation. And if we do not focus on innovation today, we will die as an economy. Today, we have three advantages in India. You have language, meaning an access to English and all of the 27 other Indian languages. You have access to an age-old culture from a cradle to grave. We sing and dance our way. We have our stories. We know our place, meaning we understand place, context, and the content that stories provide us. So we are not a lost generation. We then have this entire vibrant existing diversity, whether it's in the artisanal space, the artisans, or in the creative space. We don't use subsidy per se to be able to go to learn our Bharatnatyam or our Kathak or our classical violin or learn how to weave or stitch or even to throw the simple clay pot or the diya on the wheel. But all of these things need need to be valued. Now, when you're throwing that clay diya, which we buy at 2 rupees or 5 rupees or 10 rupees today, you and me, if we were trying to throw a piece of clay on a potter's wheel, it would amount to nothing. But it takes that 7 years to be able to do that even basic thing. So how do you value that? So when you look at a piece of textile, say what you're wearing or Rashmi's sari that she's wearing, yes, of course, it's the cloth of the fiber, the harvest, the bringing it together, the weaving it, but it's also the age-old tradition. So until unless we realize therein lies the value. So it's not just I've spent 10 hours weaving on this loom, or I've spent 3 days weaving a sari on the loom, but it's a complex issue behind all of it. So we have to create value. And that value proposition will only come to place when you're able to create valuable, for the lack of a better word, ethnic handcrafted brands. Then you're creating value, and and people have done it. It's not that we'll be doing it for the first time. We've seen this happening across the world. And I'll give you the story of Falaudi. The Falaudi weavers, when they started 35 years ago, and they brought NID in to help them fasten their colors and create these beautiful rugs and shawls using their traditional weaving techniques. At that point of time, it was 10 families. Today, it's 200, meaning 200,000 people are impacted by the weavers of Falaudi in the region, with their exports, at least pre-COVID, going into millions of dollars. Now, you have created that. You've seen the Anokhis of the world and the Fab Indias. They may not strictly be in the way that we are saying artisanal products, but you're being able to create that. Now, Khadi Gram Udyog, Government of India, if they're able to up their game, and be able to become a global brand, you'll be able to see the value creation, like the pure, genuine Banarasi sari, where even today, for the 6 weaver families, it takes you 3 months and a waiting list of 12 months to get an authentic Banarasi woven sari on hand-spun silk, not Chinese silk. Policies that need to be put into place is to prevent dumping. That's one, because we're seeing that dumping of even basic things like the Ganesh Murti today is being manufactured in China with artificial paints and being dumped here, which then stops our basic clay potters from doing what they do. So all of this has to come from a policy perspective. Education, create value, put into place policies that enhance the possibility or the capability of people creating their brands, like Vidhi has done, or the Maheshwari weavers have done, or the Kota people have done. Again, I'm saying it's not unusual, but these are exceptions because they've used their own resources to be able to do it, despite policy that does not encourage this.
Thank you for that, Sanjoy. Any quick interventions that you'd like to make on this subject, Rashmi, before we move on? Any quick thoughts to share?
No, I think Sanjoy has covered enough, but I just wanted to sort of humanize some of these statistics by actually paraphrasing an example from One of the emergency funds that we were involved with earlier on during the pandemic, where we were giving small emergency grants, and this is actually an actual case which I'm paraphrasing, of a girl who came from, let's say, a town in central India, Lucknow. Now she is a dancer. She wants to make a living. She comes to Bombay and has had to go back because of COVID. Her typical journey, if not for COVID, would have been she's probably coming from a conservative family. Not probably, this was the case that was shared with us. So she's actually stood up to her family for a choice of making a career for herself in a different city. She comes into the city, she makes a career as perhaps starting with a backup dancer, maybe starts some classes, is able to take a house on rent, is able to perhaps find someone, gets married or not, chooses to live on her own, but is able to sustain herself. Now, here's a person who has managed to, on her own terms, figured out social access for her, which otherwise would have been, maybe she was still living in the same town. Maybe because of the circumstances around her living, she may have been married and living at home, but she's managed to utilize her skills, create social access for herself, not on the patterns and parameters set by the society, but out of choice, taking directions that she wants to take. With a certain amount of confidence, and while she's doing that, also along the way creating value for people around her, whether it's her family to whom perhaps she's sending some money back, or to the 99 people she would perhaps hire that Sanjoy spoke about earlier. And when you think about the resilience of the sector, of the economy overall, when you look at what's the impact of COVID on people who've suffered, it's mainly been the bigger organizations and the freelancers. It's the MSMEs that have managed to be more resilient. And speaking of 88% of the sector comprises of MSMEs, she would have added value to those 99 people who could have potentially survived had they been given the support system and the structure to make sense of having a career in the space. So I just want to sort of give that as an example to sort of humanize some of the larger ideas that we're talking about when it comes to who and how are we impacting people within the sector.
Absolutely. And one of the things that, as we move towards the latter half or towards the end of this conversation, one of the big things that has come up in 2020 is sort of the push towards digital. Are we overstating that promise, or are we just exploring the tip of the iceberg in order to try and get a sense of where on that spectrum we might be? I'm going to ask you guys for sort of some questions and try and get a sense of where you feel we are at. So the first question in here would be that this sort of pivoting to digital that we've seen or we've been talking about, where it has happened, do you see it as a sort of a stopgap measure, a sort of reactionary, a short-term solution? Or do you feel that the pandemic might have essentially catalyzed a change that was imminent? Then, of course, there's this whole conversation about the human interaction that's involved when we talk of the arts, right? The experience of being with other people and witnessing something and consuming something, particularly when it comes to performing arts. So are we somewhere close to finding a sort of sweet spot between physical and digital? I would also like you guys to talk about some of the ongoing innovations in this area. And perhaps, Sanjoy is somebody who has sort of spearheaded Brave New World with Jaipur Literature Festival, can give us a kind of case study of that. And Rashmi, you have a ringside view to a lot of what art organizations, museums, galleries, etc., have gotten up to. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about that. And finally, about the potential and sort of limitations that these innovations have revealed and how they might be addressed. Now, this might sound like a lot, but because all of these things are sort of interlinked, it's possibly better to answer them, take all the 4 questions together than go one by one. So I'll start with you, Sanjoy, and then move on to Rashmi.
The promise of Digital India is a promise and a work in progress. And I'm being polite and trying not to rant. So when you look at the possibility of this digital India, it is an India deeply divided. Those who have bandwidth, sometimes, like you and me right now, we haven't been bounced off Zoom, and those who don't have access. And it then comes to, so who has access to a smartphone, to Zoom, to the understanding of technology? And it goes back to the same old divide, and that divide is, while it has a potential of democratizing the space and allowing artists, artisans, etc., to access this new wonder, it's far from an equitable space at this point of time. And I don't see this changing anytime soon. And again, when we look at the space, Pragya, I just want to define the fact that, yeah, sure, a musician perhaps can collaborate. And we've seen that, when we did I Believe Art Matters, 6.5 hour, 6 hour, 45-minute non-stop performance. Yes, the musicians were able to collaborate from America and India, from Shillong to Bombay, blah, blah, blah. But what about everybody else? What about the person who used to design the sets, or used to be the lighting director, or used to be a costume designer, or used to be the helper at the back end in a Kamani or a Sriram or a Prithvi theater, or, what about them? This doesn't in any way help that cause, So that's one of the bigger issues that I think we will see going forward. So is the digital medium the solution to everything? No, it's not. Has it made a difference and leapfrogged us because of the pandemic? Absolutely, 250%. And we've seen it certainly at Teamwork, and we've been able to make that leap of faith, which we wouldn't have done should the physical entity have continued. Because we all know that when we meet physically, even as a meeting, we tend to get far more accomplished. Why? Because there's also an exchange of energy. What Zoom doesn't allow you to do is to observe whether you've had a good day, bad day, the context in from where you're coming. And because it's such an abrupt ending, it doesn't allow, as Rashmi said a little while, it doesn't allow the humanizing factor involved. And when it comes to the performing arts, if we just restrict it right now for a second to that, what is the performing? I mean, you have film, you have television, you have OTT, you have all of these people, you have all the shows in the world going on. So what is the difference? The difference is the exchange of energy. And the energy that you exchange when you're live on stage is very different from this energy in this box format. It's completely different. And we've seen that. And, yes, we've tried, and, music is easier than dance and theater. Theater is really difficult. Dance is equally difficult, because how do you focus? What do you focus on? The eye movement, or in the Indian classical dance context, and the eye movement, the hand movement, the foot movement, all three, in which case you'll be so small on your phone screen being beamed out. So, there are all of these problems. In terms of what we've been able to do, it's an exception, Pragya. I don't think this is the norm. I mean, we were very quickly, immediately after the lockdown, because I saw some stuff and I said, guys, we have to get online. And one of the reasons we did that was that we realized that every condominium was becoming a republic of its own. Every gated community was seeding from the rest of its neighborhood. And I said, if we have to track, see something in today's day, why has the COVID vaccine been developed in such a short period of time? Good, bad, ugly, efficacy, all of that apart. Because there's been a constant sharing of knowledge and information across. It's one of the biggest phenomena that's not been talked about. The way scientists have shared information and helped each other get to the next stage. And that can only happen if you allow for a free flow of knowledge and information. And that was our only motivation in setting up JLF's Brave New World. Everything followed. I mean, Art Matters followed because I was in a in a room, in a task force where I was asked, so, why do artists need money and why don't you tell them to donate to, whatever fund it was? And I'm like, I don't think you guys get what this system is. And thereafter, we realized that the artists needed a platform to perform. They needed money, and we started, evolving that space and getting to where it is. And yes, we were able to raise money. So there is money that you can make through the broadcast. The myth that it's not possible to make money off the broadcast is not true. I mean, it is a myth. It depends on how you create the product. And yes, again, for every 100 rupees we used to raise for an event that we were doing or a festival we were doing on the ground, today we raise 8 rupees for what you do online. There is a differential, but you are being able to create products, and it's only time. It's like when we went from the print media, when print media disappeared, because people realized that, yes, the newspaper may be in print, but you're getting far more eyeballs when you're advertising specifically, say, on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or whatever. So it's an evolutionary thing. In this evolutionary thing, we know that technology will improve. I was part of a thing that they're creating a hologram that we could have been in the same room as holograms speaking to each other against a green space. So all of that will change. Just to end, I think the jury is out in terms of what is the future, the immediate future. And the immediate future is and will continue to be impacted until and unless there is intervention at the policy level, at the taxation level, at the central government policy level, and at the state government's attitude to being able to roll out adequate support measures and safety net measures for the community of artists and artisans and the creative economy. And if they don't do that, kickstarting this aspect will be that much tougher every week that goes by.
We are almost out of time, so I'm going to ask you, Rashmi, we have a comment here from one of our attendees, Shreya Nagarajan Singh, who says, great points made by the panelists, but we think that the call to action to implement policies and change in the sector is what is needed. And therefore, that naturally brings us to the recommendations of the report. Rashmi, if you could just kind of take us through what the recommendations are of the report and what you make of them, then that will be our final question before I hand over to Jonathan for closing remarks.
Sure, Pragya. Thank you for that. And I'll just speak to the last point that Sanjoy raised, is that what is the immediate future, right? And I think here is where I also want to bring in one of the findings. When you're talking about immediate future, it is survival. We're talking about a sector that is currently living a hand-to-mouth existence, and they are leaving the sector. And there is no way to map that kind of deeper level nuanced impact as yet. So the immediate future for us, and this is actually forms a part of one of our first recommendations, is we just need an emergency action for investment between government and corporates. And how can we do that? What does it speak to? It doesn't speak to creating new policies, new frameworks at this stage. It's just to begin with just addressing the core problem, which is people need money to get food and get shelter. And how can we look at microgrants to ensure that these microgrants reach the right people so that they're able to at least extend their runway over the next few months until they figure out what directions we want to take, and until some of the advocacy that we're doing around doing something about the dismal situation that we find ourselves in picks up movement. So the first action that we've recommended as a recommendation is how can we look at investment between government and corporates? If you have existing funding within the Ministry of Culture, within the zonal cultural centers, how can those grants be dispersed immediately, sooner rather than later? How is it that we can ensure that there's a mandate within the CSR funding plan for the arts, and that continues, that it doesn't move to other areas, because this is equally important. The second area that we had made a recommendation in is just strengthening of the creative economy for India's international competitive advantage. So here we had recommended that we need to look at, to begin with, from a recovery, social and economic recovery perspective, to not have the cultural sector not be a part of it is a problem. So when you're talking about, recovery in the manufacturing sector, in jobs, in education, the creative sector has to be a part of that. So to include our voices in that larger dialogue, in the larger economic recovery plan would be key. Secure and strengthen the creative economy for the long term. So if you've got existing festival schemes, how can you pivot them to create digital festivals so that at least for the next year or so, the artists are able to do some amount of work online and get some amount of funding to even have the room to innovate and make mistakes if they have to. In adversity lies opportunity. So if there is an opportunity here, let the artists, organizations figure out where those opportunities lie. And existing funds can be used in that direction, as opposed to saying, oh, we can't do live events, so we're going to hold on to this fund, the budget allocation that we have at the moment. And I think the main thing is also looking at existing policies that we have. So if you've got a smart city policy, how is it that we're allowing the smart city policy to have socially distanced performing spaces in public spaces? How are we looking at, involving this community in existing policy work that you're doing either before the pandemic or, just after right now? Where is the space for our work within these larger conversations? And finally, how do we establish the creative economy networks of artists, artisans, and cultural organizations? Because we know that there is no one central space that we can go to make our voices heard, to do the research that we want to. So how do we create a network of associations that is able to then speak to the power that be for collective advocacy, where we can pool resources for mutual support so that everybody's not reinventing the wheel at the same time? And also we're able to ensure shared learning across, the diversity of India's languages, creative industries, and art forms. At the end, I do want to speak to Pragya, your previous question about digital, and speak about what that means for us collectively, right? If you are talking about creating a stronger network for the sector that can lean on itself, I think thinking about what digital means and what this new opportunity means for us is something to think about. One of the workshops that we were running late last year, was on cultural management in the digital age. And what was remarkable about that workshop, we had 40 fellows as a part of the 8-session workshops from about 16 different cities in India. That kind of collective energy and engagement, of course it's online, it's nowhere compared to the kind of energy that would be translated, as Sanjay was saying, in a physical format. But the fact that we could do 40 people at a fraction of the cost in terms of learning, it is possible today. And those are the opportunities that we could potentially take advantage of. At the same time, it's important to understand that we can't have live and digital at two opposite ends of the spectrum. They have to be spoken of for the value that they bring to the table. Personally, I don't think digital can replace life. But what digital can do is add perhaps another model to life. And if we are able to sort of think of these dynamics and use the network to think through some of these challenges and share learning as one area, to ensure that the government looks at the cultural sector and the creative economy as a part of its ongoing policies, dialogues, conversations around how they're recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic, and to ensure that whatever existing money, infrastructure, support that they can give to the sector immediately or in partnership with the corporates, in order for us to, at the very minimum, survive, at the very minimum, ensure that those, sort of 72%, or rather 26% who will not survive beyond March 2021 can survive. These for us would be the key recommendations to begin with, and we will get to policy. But we believe that it's best to start with what we have, as opposed to asking them to write a new script at this stage, given that we're still in the midst of the impact that the pandemic has created.
Here. Jonathan, over to you. Final thoughts. You've been patiently listening in to all the wonderful things that Rashmi and Sanjoy have had to say. Final thoughts on what they've been sharing with us, on your takeaways from the report, and how that might inform what the wonderful work that you do at British Council, and what's next in this exercise that you guys have taken on together.
Thanks, Pragya. Well, really, in summary, I think Sanjoy and Rashmi have kind of picked up all of the various threads that come through in terms of the report. But the philosophical understanding is that India's arts and culture is part of its global brand. It's part of its DNA, as has been described in terms of the kind of thinking around Sanskriti. But it's also part of its livelihoods, its income generation, its wider sense of the world. And all of these things kind of come together in this report. And as we look to the next edition and the next set of surveys, I also just want to make sure that we thank those who've supported us and helped us disseminate the second round of the survey. And just to make sure I don't miss anybody critical, I'm just going to list them now in order. So Artisans, the Association of Designers of India, Artistic License, Arts Think South Asia, Bangalanatok.com, the Bombay Institute of Critical Analysis and Research, Jagriti Theatre, Ladakh Arts and Media Organization, Nityagram, thus, and 200 million artisans were all part of the dissemination of the second survey. We had a whole host of other survey supporters in the first round, and we'll be looking to expand that network as we go into the second round of the survey. And we'll be looking to publish the Taking the Temperature at round 3 as we reach the end of this financial year in March. We'll probably be launching the third report in April time, so that we understand what's been the full impact across the full creative economy here in India for a full financial year. We think that's unique globally to be able to really track and trace the full extent of a pandemic on one sector in one nation. But we also know the need of the hour is for support of the sector from within the sector and from without the sector. And we need that support to be live and now. So that's the message of what we need to really also be considering. This isn't about the long term, it's also about the short term need, care of the emergency. And with that said, I'll hand back to you, Pragya. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. All of you who tuned in and who were listening to us, thank you for your patience. And I hope you will spread the word about the report and about this discussion and about some of our concerns. And the rest of you, congratulations on a job. Really, really, really well done. And thank you for this report. Jonathan, Rashmi, Ardex, Sanjoy, Vicky, Mr. Chinoy, all of you, thank you very much. And thank you for being patient and listening to me as well. That's all from us.